Let me first, if I can, introduce Yuval Levin, who is directing the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies program at the American Enterprise Institute, where he holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. He is the founder and the editor of National Affairs, a really boring journal that has thick articles, just text, no pictures, but is really—
We have charts.
Yeah, just charts. Yes,
That's
yes,
even worse than just text, no pictures.
And is read by everybody around town. It's a wonderful. He's also a senior editor at the New Atlantis. He's a contributing editor at National Review and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. He leads this program, this research division that looks at the foundations of self-government, future of law, regulation, and constitutionalism. He and his colleagues, several of whom are regulars at Faith Angle and friends of this program, explore sort of the deeper state of American social, political, and civic life, focusing on the preconditions that are necessary for a flourishing society. He worked on the Domestic Policy Council with George W. Bush's administration. He was executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics, congressional staffer at the committee level, the staffing level, leadership level. And he holds a PhD and an MA from the Committee on Social Thought at University of Chicago, a program that, if you know it, is special and comes out in a lot of his writing. That's appeared at the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, the New York Times, Commentary, and elsewhere. He is the author of, most recently, one of the books, I think the one that's holding up your stack of gift books today, which is A Time to Build, from family and community to Congress and the campus, how recommitting to our institutions can revive the American dream. Thank you for coming, Yuval. Take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Josh. I appreciate it. It's always nice to be part of what you all do, and I especially think back fondly to the years when Mike Cromarty would do this. Mike was my colleague for 10 years at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and an extraordinary person. I like to think this program still has a bit of his really one-of-a-kind personality, and the focus, the emphasis on helping journalists get a better sense of the full diversity of American society and the dimensions of that society that aren't always obvious to people in journalism is just tremendously important. I'm very glad to be able to be part of it. There are a lot of things we could talk about. I'm glad to talk about any of them as we enter into conversation. What Josh asked me to start with is a little bit of what is in the book that you have, a book called A Time to Build that came out now 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago almost, and that tries to think a little bit about the nature of the social crisis that Americans are living through. And so I'll say a little bit about that and about how it might relate to the kind of work that you do, and to a question that I think has to be on the mind of anybody in and around journalism, but also in and around public policy, which is a question about the nature of trust in American society and how it can be built and sustained, especially by professionals, by people who are in the business of conveying expertise and knowledge and information, as in one way or another all of you are. To say that we're living in a social crisis, in one sense it's obvious. In another sense, it's a little hard to make sense of. I think that it's a crisis that extends well beyond the kinds of challenges we've dealt with in just the last few years around the pandemic, around race, around the insanity of our politics. All of that is part of it, but I do think that what we're looking at is a kind of social breakdown that we've been living with for longer than that, and that expresses itself in an unusual variety or diversity of symptoms. You can see it in everything from the bitter partisanship of our politics, the intensity of the kind of culture war we live with in every part of American life, but also in a lot of people's personal lives. It expresses itself as a kind of loneliness and isolation, that has sent suicide rates skyrocketing, that has led to an epidemic of opioid abuse in large parts of our society. These symptoms are clearly different from each other, and yet I think we all have a sense that they're connected somehow. And it's not always easy to put our finger on exactly how, on what it is that ties them together and allows us to talk about this moment as a crisis in some coherent way. There are a lot of things we might say about what it is that might hold them together. I think a lot of us have a sense that it has to do with sociality, with how we hang together as people, with the ways in which we are connected. But the vocabulary we have for talking about social connection in American life is often a little bit thin. When we think about the kinds of problems that emerge at the intersection of American individuals, we tend to still think about individuals. We tend to imagine our society as a big open space full of individuals who are having trouble connecting now. And so we talk about building bridges, we talk about breaking down walls or leveling playing fields. These are not wrong as metaphors. They're helpful. They're part of what needs to happen. But I think that what they miss is that social life in a free society is not just a bunch of individuals trying to connect. There's also an essential element of social structure that is much harder for us as Americans to talk about. Ways in which people hang together as groups. And when we look at the terrain of American social life now, a lot of what is breaking down are not just connections among individuals, but precisely these structures. Or more importantly, when we look at American social life, it's not just a bunch of individuals. It is full of these structures of social engagement, structures which we can call institutions. Institution is a very broad term. It has a lot of definitions in the social sciences. But I think that we can say very broadly that institutions are the durable forms of our common life. They're the ways in which people connect with each other and hang together. An institution is geared toward a purpose, which the people within it have in common. Maybe they're there to educate children or to enforce the law or to produce some kind of good or service in the economy. Maybe they have a civic purpose or a political purpose. They're organized together around that goal, and the institution gives each of them a role in relation to that purpose and in relation to one another. So maybe you're a student in a school and you have a particular connection to the principal and the teachers and the parents, and ultimately the purpose of the institution provides the goal, but the structure of the institution helps you know who you are in relation to those other people and how you can work together to achieve that goal. We as Americans don't like to talk about institutions. We like to imagine that we don't need them, that they don't exist. We treat them as invisible. We think of what we do in society in very, very individualistic terms. But in fact, institutions are absolutely essential to everything we do together in American life. And they're essential to the formation of our personal lives too. If you ask yourself, who are the 5 people in your life who you know best and know you best? And then think, how do I know those people? The answer is going to involve family and work and school, maybe church, maybe some civic organization, maybe sports. All of those are institutions. If you ask yourself what's an institution, think of those kinds of places. And part of what that means is that the important role that institutions play is not just in giving you a way to work together with other people, but because they're social forms, they're also formative. They shape you. They shape each of us, our character, our habits, our souls. And ultimately, what it means to be part of the work of an institution is to be shaped by it, to be a particular kind of human being. We can see this in the professional world. You'll spend a few minutes talking to somebody and then say, what do you do? And she'll say, I'm an accountant. And you think, yeah, that makes sense. You're an accountant. That's not surprising at all. And the reason is that the profession gives you a kind of shape, a kind of role. You don't always come in with it, but you come to take it on over time. And I think the way in which institutions are formative is very important for thinking about the kind of social crisis that we're living through now in American life. Because oftentimes the ways that institutions shape us has a lot to do with why we trust them and why we trust other people in our lives. Because what it means to be shaped by an institution at some level is to be constrained, to be given a particular kind of form that answers to an idea of integrity, right? So we trust a business when it seems like it's a business that shapes the people within it to take its goal seriously, but also to achieve it with some degree of reliability, responsibility, accountability. We trust a profession when it seems like it shapes the people within it to do its work in a trustworthy way. You can obviously see this in your own profession. Part of what it means to be a journalist is to tell the wider world that you operate in a particular way, that you answer to a certain kind of ethic, of integrity, that before you say something, it's gone through a process within an institution that you're part of. And therefore, when you do say something, you're not just talking. This has been through a process of verification, and we're not just listening to you, we're listening to the entire institution that you're part of, and we have some reason to think that it can speak to us with authority. Science works the same way. When a scientist says something, it's not just a smart person talking, but rather an individual who is speaking out of a process, out of a form, out of a way of shaping knowledge before it's expressed to the broader public. A lot of what institutions do for us is that they allow us to benefit from the ways in which they build trust through formation. They say to the world, these people are not just people, these people are professionals. They're lawyers, they're doctors, they're journalists, and therefore there's a reason for you to take them seriously in the particular domain that they speak into. And I think that's important right now because a lot of the crisis of trust that we see in American life has to do with a loss of the sense among the broader public that institutions still play this role. When we listen to a scientist now, too often, too many Americans think, well, that's just another person saying another thing. When we listen to journalists, I think a lot of Americans have that sense too. And it's the same in a lot of domains of American life. Some of that has to do with just the populist character of this moment. We're just not in a mood to trust anybody. But some of it also has to do with transformations within our institutions that make it harder to trust. And you know, the crisis of trust Americans live through now is in part a crisis of trust in institutions. In a sense that's really obvious. It's one of the best demonstrated facts in public opinion that Americans don't trust institutions. And not just that, but that we've lost trust in them over a period of decades in a very, very dramatic way. Gallup takes account of trust in institutions in a standardized way that they've done since 1948. They ask about a certain set of institutions. They'll add one or two every now and then, but you have some questions that go back all the way to the 40s and 50s. And what you find is starting around the end of the 1960s, a collapse of trust in institutions. Every American institution, with the exception of the U.S. military, and we can talk about why that might be, is now trusted by far, far fewer Americans than was the case 50 years ago. And in many cases, the collapse has been just an absolutely dramatic, disastrous falling of trust. That's very true with regard to our governing institutions. In 1974, the year after Watergate, the year that Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace, you still had a majority of Americans expressing trust in the presidency. And now you have about a quarter of Americans expressing trust in the presidency. Trust in Congress is barely in double digits. There were a couple of years in the last decade when it was not in double digits. The trust in the professions is not as low, but it has declined very dramatically. Whether that's journalism, whether that's medicine, whether that's science, Americans don't trust professionals. One of the reasons for that loss of trust certainly has to do with just traditional kinds of measures of competence. In the 21st century in particular, Americans have lived through examples of incompetence among professionals that are hard to ignore. And again, this is especially true in our governing institutions, whether that's in Iraq, whether that's the financial crisis, whether that's the pandemic. Americans feel like they have a lot of reasons not to trust professionals. And that's part of what's going on here. Part of it is also a kind of evident corruption in some institutions. Certainly it becomes harder to trust people with power when they seem like they use that power for their own benefit. But both of these challenges, the challenge of demonstrating competence and the danger of corruption, are in a sense always with us. And they're always evident in public opinion about trust in institutions. What you really find in the 21st century, and I would say the collapse of trust has accelerated dramatically in the 21st century, is, I think, a different kind of dynamic that has driven a further loss of trust. And it has to do exactly with the formative purpose of institutions that I started with. I think there is, broadly speaking, a sense among a lot of people in our country that institutions are not functioning formatively now, but rather performatively. That they don't take individuals and shape them in a particular way and turn them into a member of Congress or a scientist or a corporate CEO, but rather function for those people as platforms for performance, for building a personal brand, for building a following, and allow those people to stand on a platform and be visible, rather than turning them within the life of the institution into a more trustworthy kind of human being, a professional of one sort or another, or someone shaped by institutional responsibility. I think a lot of Americans have the sense that our institutions have gone from being formative to being performative, and therefore that the people within them are much harder to trust. We can see this in a lot of arenas of American life. In politics, I think it's particularly evident. I spent a lot of time with members of Congress for my sins, and it has been really a dramatic transformation to witness. A lot of members now, especially younger members, although not only younger members, have come to see the role they play in fundamentally performative terms, rather than thinking that they have entered an institution that plays a kind of purpose, and seeing that purpose in legislative terms. That is, the purpose of Congress is to compel negotiation and accommodation between people on different sides of important questions. That just is the purpose of Congress. But a lot of members don't think of themselves that way at this point, and instead see being in Congress as being on a particularly prominent platform in the culture war, being in a place that allows them an unusual amount of prominence and access to public attention, that gains them a better time slot on cable news or talk radio, and that allows them to stand on a platform and perform, to stand and yell. A lot of members now basically run to channel the frustrations of their voters by expressing them, rather than by allowing them to enter into a process of bargaining and negotiation toward addressing problems in our society. And they'll run that way. They'll run saying, I'm not going to go over there and make deals with the other party. I won't betray you. Well, making deals with the other party is the job they're running for. There are other things they could do. Our economy provides people with plenty of opportunities to do all kinds of things. But if you're going to run for Congress, you're running to play a part in an institution whose work is bargaining. And if you're promising your voters that you won't do that, you're saying you think of your job in a very, very different way than the institution does. And you don't find a lot of members now being formed into that human type that is a member of Congress. There is such a type. It's recognizable. And some members still do this, especially members who come from state legislatures, which still does happen, particularly among the Democrats. There are people who have risen in politics as legislators and actually still have an idea of what that means. But increasingly, younger members of Congress do not operate that way, do not think that way. They measure themselves by performative standards, and they understand their place in the institution that way. If you attend a congressional hearing now, you're watching people produce YouTube clips. Rather than engage with one another or with a witness who they've called, you'll see in particularly high-profile hearings, you'll see members, one after another, ask this poor person the same question. And why do you need to ask it again? He just answered it when that person asked it. Well, because you need a clip of you asking that question. You're basically there producing internet entertainment. I think we've seen something like that process happen around the presidency, not just in the Trump years, though certainly especially in the Trump years, but a sense that the president's role also is fundamentally performative, that that's the highest stage in the culture war, and that that's what it means to be president, rather than operating from within the system and kind of working the executive branch to achieve traditional political goals. We find our presidents now standing on the executive branch and delivering messages. I think the courts have resisted this better than most, and they've done this in ways that we can learn from. The courts, for the most part, have resisted cameras. You have this now in some federal appeals courts, but certainly not in the Supreme Court. They've maintained spaces that are still private arenas for deliberation, and that's their role. Congress has entirely lost these private arenas for deliberation. There's almost nowhere to go except the leadership offices at midnight before a government shutdown to just have a conversation that isn't being watched by other people. And that's why all the work gets done in the leadership offices at midnight before a government shutdown, because the kind of work they do cannot happen entirely in public. And if everything they do is entirely in public, then they cannot do their work. You find a lot of members in both houses saying their favorite part of the job is participating in the work of the Intelligence Committee. Well, that work is terrifying and difficult, but it is also private. And it's a place where they get to say, I don't know about this, tell me more about it, which you could never do in a public hearing. It's a place where they actually get to know their fellow members of Congress, and there's a lesson to learn there. There's a lesson to learn about how institutions function. But I think in some ways we see the same thing operating in a lot of institutions outside of politics. There's obviously a version of it in journalism, where rather than working through an institution and benefiting from the capital, the trust capital that it provides, we find a lot of journalists now on Twitter operating as individuals and doing work that is indistinguishable from just the expression of their personal opinions. Some of it is very valuable. They're actually doing real reporting and providing a lot of information, but it is very hard to tell apart from personal expression. And that means that it is very hard to trust, and that it makes the work of journalists in general harder to trust when we just know them too well. We see too many facets of them that are not their professional selves. It makes it much harder to have confidence in the work they do. I think you find the same kind of thing happen in corporate America. You find it happening in the religious world, where institutions that are fundamentally there to shape and form souls are being used instead for political expression, and to sort of prove that you're in this party and not in that party. And you see the same kinds of cultural deformations happening there that you find in Congress, a kind of celebrity culture that emerges around the leaders of religious communities that ultimately ends up treating the church as a platform, as a stage. The same kind of thing is happening in the academic world, which again, you have an institution that is there to advance knowledge through teaching and learning, but that instead becomes a platform for expression. And expression is not the same as teaching and learning. Expression is not the same as civic action and political action. And I think we too often now mistake the two and think that when we've said something, we've done something. And it's not true. When you've said on Twitter or TikTok that you agree with this or that, you haven't changed the world at all. And I think we've come to see in this moment, in this period in American life, we've come to see expression as action to a dangerous degree. And we sort of reflect this back on our understanding of American history too. When people want to express a strong political view now, or opposition to something in our politics, there's a tendency to recreate the appearance of a protest movement, but without the underlying institutional infrastructure of a protest movement. So you just show up on the street with signs, and then it all dissipates and goes nowhere. And we think we've done something like the civil rights movement of the 60s, but you know what? The civil rights movement was not fundamentally about holding up signs. Bringing 1 million people to Washington in the summer of '63 was a way of saying, we can bring 1 million people to the voting booth in November of '64. And it was understood that way. It was a way of showing organizational power, not a way of expressing opinion. And I think some of our technologies and a lot of our cultural evolution has meant that we've lost sight of the difference between expression and action. But more importantly, that we've lost the ability to have real trust in people within our institutions because we think they're all fundamentally involved in expression. And we think that what there is to know about them is what party they're in and what their view is on this issue or that issue. And I think a lot of professionals in American life, operating out of good motives, of wanting to show that they're on what they take to be the right side of an important question, have made it very difficult for people to have confidence in the work they do because they just seem like they're political activists. And so in wanting to say, you know, our company also believes in this or that, in abortion rights or voting rights, what they're saying to voters is, you can't really buy shoes from us anymore because we're on the other side of a big divide. And that makes it very, very hard to work together in a free society, because part of what it means to live in a diverse society is to always be engaged in common action with people you don't agree with. There's no avoiding that. There's no way around that. And you have to be able to trust them That even though they might be on the other side of a big issue from you, they're still going to treat you in the right way within the boundaries of the work of the institution that they're part of. Losing that is losing a lot. And I think it's not only meant that we've lost a lot, but because it operates through this dynamic of institutional work, it means that it's been hard for us to understand the nature of what we've lost, and therefore hard for us to understand the nature of the social crisis we're living through. It's part of why all these different symptoms seem to connect in ways that are not evident to us, that are not obvious to us, because they happen in a terrain that we often treat as invisible and frequently don't see. I think when you see it a little better, the natural question is, what can we do about it? And there's no easy answer to that because of the nature of the problem. Ultimately, we have to gradually rebuild our trust in institutions in American life and our capacity to have trust in institutions. And the hard thing about that is that it doesn't begin by talking about what other people should be doing better. It begins by each of us, ourselves, wherever we are and whatever institutions we are part of, doing a little better on this front and forcing ourselves in important moments of action or decision to ask a basic question that goes unasked now in American life, which is, given my role here, how should I behave? Given that I am a member of Congress or a teacher or a journalist or the President of the United States, what's required of me in this situation? Not just what do I want, but given the role I have, what should I do? That's a question that I think has become a lot less natural to a lot of us. It's a constraining question because often the answer is not just what you want to do, but what's required of you given the obligations you have, the responsibilities you have, the privileges you have, the power you have. We all ask this question now and then in our personal lives. You know, someone will cut me off on the highway and I'll want to scream what I think of them and then remember there's kids in the back and I'm just not going to do that. That's a little bit like what's missing in a lot of American life. And we often find ourselves looking at people and thinking, he's the President of the United States. How is he doing that? Well, the fact is he just didn't ask himself the question, what should I do given that I'm the President? Constantly we find ourselves asking that sort of question about people in all kinds of positions. And I think beginning by asking ourselves, given my role here, what's required of me, and then demanding the same of other people might help us to understand what we're missing, what we need to push for, what we need to do differently. And then can also help us understand how institutions need to change. And I do want to say it's important to see that institutions need to change. The problem we face is not just that Americans don't trust institutions, but that institutions are not trustworthy enough. And there are a lot of ways, of course, in which what it means to make them more trustworthy is not just to build up the public's confidence in them, it's to make them more trustworthy. It's to reform them and change them in ways that make them more worthy of our confidence. There are a lot of reasons why Americans don't trust institutions. It's not ridiculous. It's not silly. Institutions can be very constraining and restricting. They can limit our freedom of action. Sometimes they are, in fact, literally oppressive. Right? A term like institutional racism, that's not a metaphor in America. That's a reality for a lot of people. And it's crucially important to see that powerful institutions are very dangerous and that we do need to think about how to restrain them and constrain them. There are a lot of times when the problem in American life is that our institutions are too powerful, even too trusted. I think you look at America in the middle of the 20th century, and that's a society with too much trust in its institutions. But where we're living now, we're a society with too little trust. And we have to think about how to regain our capacity to build the trust of our fellow citizens and also to build our own trust in the various institutions we're part of. And so beginning by asking ourselves what we can do differently has to lead us to think about how we can change institutional structures and incentives. Incentives really matter. Those members of Congress are not idiots. They're very intelligent men and women. They're responding in smart ways to the incentives they face. And the incentives they face are the problem. And that means we've got to think about political reform. We've got to think about structural reform in a variety of institutions, in the academy and in the church and in journalism and in every place that matters to us. We have to ask ourselves, how do we make it reasonable and rational for people with power in this institution to actually behave responsibly. And that will require a lot of change. But to begin with, I think it just requires seeing the problem in this particular way and thinking about responsibility and about trust and about accountability in ways that take account of the nature of American institutions. I think that's one way to see the breadth of what has gone wrong and the depth of it, and to afford ourselves some ways to take action, some ways to do more than just stand around and think, boy, all these people are really doing a terrible job. We need different people in politics or in the business world. We have to go one layer further and ask ourselves how we get there and what it is we expect of them. And I think thinking in institutional terms can help us do at least a little more of that. Maybe that's what I'll say to start, Josh, and we can talk about any facet of that or anything else that's on your mind.
Thank you, Yuval, for that comprehensive institutional smackdown and stiff tonic on a Monday morning. We're going to go over to you. So if you've got a question, would you maybe put up your table tent and get in the queue? And all this is on the record unless you say, like, this is off the record. So sincerely, Yuval, thank you very much for that. It was awesome. Who's up? Come on, institution of journalism isn't too beat down. Right. Matthew Chua from Texas Tribune.
Please.
Okay. I wanted to ask a bit, you brought up this really interesting point of this, the fact that a lot of members of Congress really appreciate their time on the intelligence community because it's private. And I understand the pragmatics of being able to work in a setting that's, you don't have to perform, but also there's this tension with the need for accountability and public accountability.
Yep.
In talking of incentives, what's a way that you think would be a good way to kind of balance those two issues?
Thank you. It's a great question. And I should say, I love C-SPAN. I watch it all the time. I'm that kind of political junkie. But I should also say that I think C-SPAN has done real damage to the character of the institution of Congress. And there's a balance to be struck. There is absolutely a need for accountability, even a need for transparency in the work of an institution like the U.S. Congress. But I think that has to be done in a way that recognizes the nature of the work that Congress does. Certainly, members have to be accountable for the legislation they produce, for the work they do and what they vote for. And everything they vote for has to be available to the public, ideally in advance, and they have to be answerable for it. But how do they produce legislation? The institution of Congress is ultimately a legislature, and that means that its work is bargaining and accommodation. And bargaining cannot happen in public. If you're watching bargaining happen in public, you're watching a show. You're not watching the real thing. People do not make concessions in public, and they don't ask questions in public. They don't try out ideas. They just don't. And so I will tell you, having worked for a congressional committee, having worked for a House leadership, real negotiation only happens in private. And that means there has to be somewhere for members to negotiate in private. Now, what they produce in those negotiations has to be shown to the public, and they have to be accountable and answerable for it. But the process of giving and taking, there's got to be somewhere to do that. I think having C-SPAN cameras on the floor of the House and Senate, that's fine. The floor of the House and Senate have always been a show. Nobody's ever been persuaded of anything on the floor of the House of Representatives. That's not a new problem. But committee work, which is really where both houses do their actual work, there has to be some private space for members to talk to each other. And to talk to each other in what I would say to you, maybe not to them, as talk to each other in vulnerable ways. To say, look, I understand, but I have to represent this constituency. The unions are just not going to go for it. Or, social conservatives will kill me if I do this. They have to be able to talk to each other that way. And they cannot do that in public. So that I think moving cameras into committee rooms and having cameras in every public committee space, and I say public because there is a balance to be struck. There is a way to allow people into the room without allowing cameras into the room. The difference is a big difference. Committees need some genuinely public events. Some hearings really ought to be on TV. They also need some hearings that are more like Supreme Court sessions. A small group of people can be in the room. Journalists too, but don't put it on television. That's very different from having it be reported the next day. And they need some genuinely private spaces. I think they can do this very easily. They don't have to kill C-SPAN. They can just create a new genre of committee work. Call it a business session and have it be closed, as closed as the Intelligence Committee, so that they agree not to talk about the details, but to come out with a product. Otherwise, what happens is legislation ends up getting produced outside the committee process. And that is what has happened. When Congress does work now, think about the last Congress. There was some real legislation in the last Congress, right? There was an infrastructure bill, there was a gun bill, bills on difficult issues. How were they produced? They were produced by a group of 20 senators who met in private in Susan Collins' office to produce legislation. The infrastructure bill was not written by the staff of the Transportation Committee, who are the only people who actually know anything about infrastructure on Capitol Hill. But they couldn't use them because they didn't want to do this in a public way. I think that's just ridiculous. And Congress has to restructure itself in a way that takes account of the problems it now faces. There has to be a way to do real committee work in genuinely private ways. So that's a long way of answering your question, but I think it's entirely possible to balance accountability and even transparency with the need for genuine legislative work. And Congress has not found that balance. It now leans way too heavily in the direction of transparency. And nobody wants to say we need to be less transparent. I get that. That's a weird thing to say. But the fact is they need to be less transparent. They need to be capable of legislative work.
Let's go to Ryan Struck with CNN. And maybe hit that button if you would, Ryan. It'll help for later on.
Okay. Cool. Thanks so much for being here. I was wondering if you could talk about just like the recent democratization of how people get their information, and whether that you think provides a unique incentive for people to perform and not be formed by institutions. And then I was going to, secondly, when it comes to finding a solution, how do people who are trying to rebuild trust in institutions have success when we have so many echo chambers in our media, and there's going to be whole groups of the population who are going to be viewing that attempt to rebuild institutional trust as something that is actually trying to drag the institution down.
Yeah, thank you. Those are very good connected questions. I'd say a few things. It's certainly true that the nature of 21st century media and journalism has been a big part of why we've seen the process that I've described. I would say, though, that we should not take mid-20th century media as a norm. The norm in American history is extremely fractured and fragmented partisan journalism. You look at the journalism of the early republic, you can think of whatever great statesman of that period you want to. They were throwing mud. They owned the newspapers. I mean, look at the New York Post, and it tells you at the top that Alexander Hamilton founded the New York Post. Okay, we take that for granted. That's a strange fact, right? Alexander Hamilton was a politician. He was a leader of the Federalist Party in New York, and one of the ways in which he tried to engage in politics was to start a newspaper so that the party could deliver to its voters its own version of reality. There's a lot of newspapers throughout the country called the This and That Democrat Gazette or Republican Tribune. Why are they called that? Because they were owned by the political parties, literally. The norm of a kind of professionalized journalism with its own schools, with its own formal ethics, really only emerged in the 20th century. And it was part of the larger kind of growth in scale of a lot of American industries and the standardization and formalization of a lot of American life. It had great benefits. It did have some drawbacks. It created one echo chamber rather than a million echo chambers. And in some ways that's better, but in some ways that's worse. Whatever we think of it, we're not going back to it. I think we have to think about the kinds of incentives that 21st century American journalism creates and which of them need to be changed and how that could happen. So we do now have, again, a fragmented partisan journalism, but I think we also have a journalism that has a very distinct kind of economic model, where, basically the internet, even before social media, but maybe especially social media, means that the kind of advertising model that supported journalism throughout much of its history, which was a general reach advertising model, right? The department store wants to reach as many people as possible. So it wants to advertise in a newspaper that will reach as many people as possible. And that means the newspaper has to be formulated in a way that will appeal to as many people as possible. That's no longer the case. There's now targeted advertising. The paper can tell the advertiser exactly who its readers are, and it needs to keep exactly those readers. And that means it needs to give those readers what they want. And every commercial media enterprise now has to feed its audience exactly what it wants. It has to keep them happy, not just large and broad. And that creates an incentive for partisan journalism. There's no way around it. It's a very powerful incentive. Even in the great journalistic institutions that do their best to avoid this, all of them have been subject to that in the 21st century. And the economics of journalism means now that it is very hard to have the kind of broad reach journalism that was the norm 2 generations ago. I think the question is, what can we do going forward? There are some models of trying to do this. There are some models of nonprofit journalism that have tried to do that. The Texas Tribune is a great model, which not only tries to avoid some of the commercial incentives, but also provides a lot of its work to local newspapers. And so allows people to get information about their state and local politics that otherwise is very, very difficult to find given the economic incentives that face other kinds of journalism. It's really hard now to know what's going on in the state legislature. I live in the state of Maryland, which, where there's one state newspaper. It's sort of out once a week. And if I want to know just what's the State House doing, what's going on, you have to work very hard to do that. Whereas it's much easier to find out what's going on in Congress. It's much easier to find out what the president is saying. So I think along both of these axes, both in terms of allowing people to have more information about where most of the governing in our country actually happens at the state and local level, and changing some of the incentives that drive the fragmentation of journalism, there's a lot of experimentation to do. There's a lot of work to be done. I don't think anybody's found the right model. And instead what we're left with are these fragmented echo chambers. And so I agree with you. If you try to reform our governing institutions in ways that encourage Congress to be more an arena for accommodation and bargaining, a lot of the people who most closely follow politics would see that as a disaster, would see that as a bad thing, as giving in to the other guys who they hate with a passion. I do think, though, that it's also the case that a lot of other people, a lot more people, would see that as an improvement. And that at the end of the day, if our parties actually thought like national political parties, that is, if they tried to build broad coalitions, they would find that creating a more accommodating politics that's a little less crazy would actually be pretty appealing. Neither of them thinks this way. Neither of them has thought this way now for a generation. And maybe that's one more thing to say about this moment is what's been distinct about the last 30 years is that we've had a 50-50 politics. Not that it's been polarized. American politics is always polarized. Republicans and Democrats have hated each other's guts since the 1850s when the Republican Party was created. We're always polarized. We are by no means always at 50-50. That's a very unusual situation. There's generally a majority party and a minority party, and then there's a realignment and they switch sides. We have not had a majority party in American politics since the 1990s. And that means that both parties operate like minority parties. Each of them is defined by the other entirely, which is how minority parties function. They exist in opposition to the majority. But we don't have a majority. And the only thing the Democrats have to say is we're not Republicans. And thank God for that. And the only thing Republicans say is we're not Democrats. And aren't you glad of that? And that kind of echo chamber is very hard to break out of. I do think that there is a constituency for breaking out of it, and that the first party that really grasps that will actually be in a place to really own the next phase of American politics, but they sure don't see it. I mean, let me tell you, spending a lot of time with politicians, they do not see it that way. Maybe they're right, they have to run for office, but right or wrong, they don't see it that way.
Let's jump next, if we can, to Matthew Brown from the Washington Post. And maybe hit that button too, Matthew, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you for being here. I'm curious your perspective on the interplay between social contracts of institutions and institutional structures. Basically, I'm curious if the forces that you're talking about that have changed American society from both the local level all the way up to the national, if their reasons for being and the structures that we've used to mediate through them, work through them, whether it's from like a civic local body all the way up to Congress, if the issue isn't so much that they are not working because of some technological reason or social reason, so much as they just haven't kept up with the new dynamics of American society. Do you think that there's a tension there, or do you think that the social contracts are persistent, perennial, and that there's just something else going on?
Well, I think these things are related. So ultimately, institutions in our society answer to a purpose, right? They exist to achieve some goal. Some goals are durable. They're always necessary. We always need basic governing institutions. There are some commercial functions that we just always need, and we always need schools, and we always need some forms of social order. We always need ways to advance some ideas of justice. Some needs come and go, or are functions of changes in American life. A lot of our foremost civic institutions were created in response to very distinct needs at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. Institutions that we think of as just sort of permanent parts of life were actually responsive to urbanization and mass immigration, and to a kind of dynamic that in some ways is very similar to what we face now, in what we now would call the progressive era. A lot of these institutions arose to cushion the difficulties of that time. The displacement that was involved in a lot of people moving from farms to cities led to the creation of all kinds of institutions to help young Americans adjust, accommodate. The YMCA, the Boys and Girls Scouts. Again, we think of them as always been around. They exist to answer a very specific kind of need. And maybe in some ways they've adapted to answer other needs, maybe not. I think we always confront both of these kinds of institutions, the ones that have to be durable and so have to evolve, and ones that, get used up. They meet the needs they were created to meet, or they fail, and we end up going somewhere else. I think one thing that does stand out about this moment a little bit is that we're not creating new institutions at the pace that Americans often have, and at the pace that you would think that the social needs of this moment would call for. We end up spending a lot of time kind of folding our arms and saying, why isn't anybody doing anything about this, rather than doing something about it. Some of that has to do with the loss of those kind of muscles for local action, for thinking this is my problem, our problem, rather than who do I need to vote for so that they'll take care of this. And some of it is a kind of nationalization of our self-understanding. I think part of what the internet and social media have meant is that we all think of what is national as being as though it were local. We think of it as our own. We think of it as the immediate. And that means we tend not to be as active in local spaces. And so I think there are some institutions that run their course, that need to be abandoned, that are working so poorly that we just need to leave them, or that need competition. You need to start a different way of thinking about how to meet this particular need. Sometimes that's what institutional reform looks like. There's some institutions that can't really be improved by competition. We can't just create another Congress and say, why don't you try this a little differently and we'll see. And so we have to fix Congress, and that's very hard. I think we have to be alert to both of these things, and in a sense, as individuals, asking ourselves, where can I do better? Some of that is just a function of what you feel called to do, what your strengths are, what you're driven to, what moves you. I do think we're going to see new institutions in a lot of arenas of American life, like journalism, like education, I think higher education will be transformed in the coming generation. Certainly, we should expect that journalism will be too. And there are other arenas where what we need to do is reform. So it does make sense to think of the basic contract of sort of why did we create this institution? Who is it answerable to? What does it owe us? And that will help us some in thinking about how to make these changes. But I wouldn't overstate how different this moment is. I wouldn't overstate the degree of complexity and difficulty. Americans in every generation, and of course not just Americans, have always lived with tremendous burdens and difficulties, with challenges of change and dynamism. I think we would have a hard time persuading the Americans of the, say, late 60s, early 70s, that our politics is more divided than theirs, or that the basic difficulties we face are harder than theirs. I think we'd have a hard time telling Americans who lived in the 1930s that it's really hard to live in the 2020s. So, we should take our challenges as they come. We should recognize that this is what it is to be a human being. Every generation and every society faces very difficult challenges. And building the future is hard, scary work. We just have to step up to it. And so thinking about these kinds of questions is not a way of asking why everything has changed. It's a way of asking how can we address the particular problems we have.
And we have about 6 or 7 questions. We're going to maybe try to go about 20 more minutes and then take a coffee break and moment and then come back with both Yuval and John picking up from here. But maybe let's go next, if we can, to Corinne Hajar from the Wall Street Journal. Hit that button if you wouldn't mind. Sorry. Thanks for that.
Thanks. So I'd like to hear what you think, but my suspicion is that institutions closer to us are easier to trust. So when we're thinking about the decline of local news, for example, local outlets, what would a revival look like, and what role would that play in restoring trust in the media?
Yeah, I do think there's generally a pattern that people trust people they know more than people they don't. There's been real decline in trust in local institutions too, but I think it's still the case that often that mistrust expresses itself as a lack of trust in the general category and not in the particular people in front of you. A lot of Americans will tell you, I hate the public schools, but my kid's teacher is just great. And that pattern is there in a lot of American life, and it's a good thing on the whole. Local journalism, local journalism has been the most obvious victim of the transformation of the economic model of journalism. It is very hard now to imagine an economic model for a thriving mid-sized city newspaper. It's just very hard to know what that would look like and how you could possibly sustain it. So I think it makes sense that some of the experimentation we've seen with state and local level journalism has been in the nonprofit space. There's only so much journalism you can really do in the nonprofit space, and it also has its own challenges. Nonprofit doesn't mean they don't need money. It just means it comes from somewhere else, and wherever it comes from is going to influence the kind of work they do. I think there are some nonprofit journalistic institutions that have managed to have a broad enough base of supporters that they are not dependent on any of them. That's what nonprofits in general tend to do. It's what DC think tanks try to do, not to depend on anybody too much so that you can be independent. I think that's a little easier to do at the state level in very large states. We can say state level in California and Texas, but California and Texas are both larger than any European nation. And so that's still a very large scale, and it means you've got a lot more of a foundation of support to draw on. It's also more possible to have a commercially viable journalism at that level. The second problem is a demand problem, which is that I think changes in American politics and polarization, culture war, just mean there's less interest in local issues. So that national political issues are more interesting to people than what's happening in their own community. And a lot of the incentives drive local politics toward national issues. There are people in my county in Maryland running for county commission by talking about immigration. And I mean, maybe I agree with you, but you have absolutely no say about immigration at the county level. It just doesn't matter what you think about it. But they need to signal what party they're in, essentially, and the only way to do that is to talk about national politics. So this is just a way of saying I have no idea how to solve the problem of local journalism in a viable way. I think it's very much worth trying to learn from the places that have done this. But what Rhode Island could learn from the Texas Tribune is not obvious to me. And I think we need local journalism for American politics to function the way it's built to function, because most governing happens at the local level and at the state level. And right now it's happening in a way that is, I mean, I'll tell you, in some ways it's helpful. Governing at the state level is much healthier than governing at the federal level, in part because voters are frankly less interested in it. But that's really no way to think about what a healthy politics looks like. And I hope some of you have ideas about local journalism, because I wish I had more.
Cara Bettis Carvello from Christianity Today.
Morning. I think you partially answered my question in addressing Matthew's question, but I'll ask it anyway. It's a little more fundamental, just in terms of, even if we understand the problem of mistrust in institutions this way, and with our value in individualism, do you think people actually are willing to change? And do you think they're willing to conform to their role within their institution? And do you think institutions, are willing to reform?
Yeah. Well, so I think the crucial word in your question is they. Why should we not say we? Are we willing to change? If we see this problem, are we willing to do something about it? I think if you ask it that way, there's much more of a positive answer than if you say they. They, I don't like them. They're the cause of the problem. But I think we can see this problem and do something about it. I answer it this way. I'll tell you a very quick story. I know that we're running out of time. I became an American when I was 19. I'm an immigrant. I was naturalized at the federal courthouse in Newark in 1996. And after we all took our oath, the federal judge who gave us the oath stood up to give a little talk. And I thought, he's going to quote Lincoln, and he didn't do any of that. I mean, I distinctly remember being disappointed with what he said. And yet, here I am telling you about it, 20 years later. What he said was, from now on, you have to talk about America in the first person. And when something's wrong, you have to say we. And when you're proud of something, you have to say we. And when you talk about terrible evils in the past, you have to say we. And that's all he said. And I thought, okay. But that's the answer to your question. I do think it is possible for people to really change the way all of us behave in what is now just an absolutely disastrous, dysfunctional public arena, if we think more in terms of we and say, can I change so that this is a little bit less bad? I think all of us can do that, yes.
Catherine Post with Religion News Service.
Good morning. So I want to offer an observation and then a question. I cover religion at the Religion News Service, unsurprisingly, and so the loss of trust in religious institutions is particularly of interest to me. I also particularly cover abuse in the church and abuse survivors, and so when it comes to loss of trust in religious institutions, that's what comes to mind for me. Abuse survivors, they lose trust in religious institutions because of hypocrisy and because of the harm they've experienced. And so it was interesting to hear about your formative versus performative model here. And the way that I was sort of thinking about that and the kind of journalism I do was thinking about how religious institutions want to perform when it comes to responding to abuse rather than do the formative work of caring for survivors, right? And actually caring about their spiritual needs. They want to preserve the appearance of integrity rather than actually fulfilling that integrity, being an institution with integrity. So it's ironic because what the survivors are asking for is always integrity. So my question is, how do we incentivize religious institutions to care well for survivors, to genuinely embrace integrity, and to be formative rather than performative?
Yeah. I've had this thought often in thinking about how various kinds of institutions in in the religious arena respond to their own failures. And oftentimes now they respond the way that a corporation would, by thinking about how do we protect our capital, how do we avoid this becoming a crisis. And you almost want to say, well, what if you were religious? What if you were Jewish or Christian? How would you respond then, Rabbi? And I think it's a form of asking the same question of kind of, given my role here, what should I be doing? The corruption itself obviously is the grave moral failing. That's not new. It's not as new as we'd like to believe. And I think part of what we've learned in a lot of these horrible crises and scandals is that this has been going on a long time. And we all know at some level that it's always been going on, that it happens in every institution. It's not distinct to religious institutions, but they're not exempt from it, as they might wish to believe they are. But it's become easier to see in some ways because we have more visibility into institutions now generally, and I think that's important. But the response to it, I think, has not been reflective enough of the fundamental character and purpose of the institutions. I haven't been an insider in the Catholic Church scandal, but as an outsider, it has looked that way. It's looked like they responded in a way that just simply didn't have anything to do with the fact that they're a church. I have seen this in some ways in my own community, in the Jewish community in Washington, where we've had a couple of significant scandals in the last 15 years, and where the first instinct has been to say, how do we contain the damage? I mean, yes, how can we redress this with victims? It's not that people are simply cold to this question, but they're pretty cold to the question. And the idea is to defend the institution. And they do think they're doing it out of a kind of religious mission. The larger community needs the institution not to collapse. Okay, but what if you were Jewish and you were thinking about this question? I almost literally find myself asking that because I do think that that's what it actually means to allow yourself to be formed by an institution that you claim to represent. So that's not quite an answer to your question, but I think that's where it would have to start. They'd have to see that they're not just generic managers who happen in this case to be running a church. That's just not how this works. And that's true in other institutions too, but obviously it speaks with particular force when the institution in question at least claims to carry a moral mission. And it would seem like that would demand something of it.
Let's go to Jacob Washington from Inside Elections.
Thank you for being here. Do you feel like there's something almost anti-democratic about the way that you're positioning, kind of, especially when it comes to members of Congress, obligations to the institution, what should someone do as a member of Congress, versus obligation to their constituents and what their constituencies want? Because it seems like for a lot of these members, what their constituents want is someone to rabble-rouse, to go on TV, to be a fighter. We hear that over and over again about people like Trump, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, they fight. So when you've got a member of Congress whose voters are consistently sending them back with landslide majorities and providing that positive feedback, is it anti-democratic to say, well, actually, no, you have different obligations to the institution of Congress and what that is meant for? And then who are you to say what those obligations are to this kind of thing that we've decided to call Congress?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say at some level it is counter-democratic, yes. We live in a liberal democracy, and part of what the liberal side means is that we don't just live in the system that has an obligation to let majorities do anything they want. Our system tries to balance the need to empower majorities with the need to protect minorities. And that's an extremely difficult thing to do because those are obviously contradictory impulses. And yet we know that when we fail to do both, at the same time, we're failing in the basic mission of liberal democracy, right? Majorities can obviously be oppressive and tyrannical of minorities. Americans know that. And at the same time, minority rule is not legitimate. And so we have to have majority rule that is also somehow protective of the basic rights and also the interests of minorities in our society, political minorities and others. The way in which we do that is through a complicated array of institutions that interact in a way that tries to enlarge majorities. You can't just get a little tiny majority and do everything you want. And that's very frustrating. It's very frustrating to little tiny majorities, which is all we've had in American politics for the last 30 years. And so you say, well, we won the election. Why can't we do this? Let's blow up the rules so that we can do this. This is what needs to happen. The rules are very important because they allow our system to remain legitimate. And they allow it to be legitimate even in the eyes of political minorities who didn't win the last election, because they know that the fact that they didn't win doesn't mean they lose all their rights, and it doesn't mean that they can never win again. So how do you sustain that really complicated political system that simultaneously empowers majorities and protects minorities, that builds consensus rather than just majority, by requiring majorities to grow before they can actually effectively act? I think part of the way you do that is through institutions that have strong ethics guided by their own purpose. Part of the way you do that, an important part of the way, is by having a Congress that understands its purpose as bargaining and accommodation and negotiation. The United States Congress is not a European Parliament where a small majority can do anything it wants because the public can throw it out at any time. The public can't throw it out at any time. The election is, we know on what date it will happen. These people are in power until then. But they don't have all the power. And the US Congress is built in a way that requires majorities to negotiate with minorities before they can act. That means that if you enter that institution as a member thinking, no, my job is not to negotiate, then you are a menace to the basic purpose of liberal democracy. You are undermining the capacity of our society to remain a free and democratic society. And so I think it's very important that the institutions of our politics shape the people within them to take on their ethos, because that ethos stands in the way of majorities that want to say, we won, we get everything. So absolutely, what I'm talking about are incentives that will cause politicians not just to do whatever their constituents want in the moment, but to understand that they have a larger responsibility to sustain this way of life, to sustain this system of government. One other thing I'd say quickly is that we have also changed our elections in ways that confuse politicians about what their constituents actually want and who they actually are. Both parties adopting primaries to select their own nominees in the 1970s has meant that they're very confused about who their constituents are. They all try to win the votes of about 12% of the electorate that shows up on primary day for their party. And that's not actually the electorate. And so I do think that those are ways we can think about some institutional reforms to help politicians be better incentivized to perform the role our system demands of them. And yeah, that role is not purely democratic. It is liberal democratic. And that piece of it is really important, because just letting today's majority do everything it wants until tomorrow's majority comes in and does the opposite is no way for a society to function.
Let's take one more question, okay, and then we'll take a break and come back with get more in with Yuval and with John Ward in just a moment. But let's go to Aisha Khan from Next City, Oregon.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the loss of third spaces. That's something I'm very interested in, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that sort of fits into this thesis on the loss of trust in institutions. Is that the same phenomenon in a different form? Just where does that fit in for you? I'm also curious about whether you see, beyond a loss of trust in institutions, a loss of trust between individuals in American society, and again, how that fits into this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think those kinds of third spaces, spaces that are, you might say, neither quite private nor quite public, or maybe they're not home and they're not work. They're somewhere else. those are often the places where our society has really lived its life. And even there are places where our society has solved its problems. Places where people can come together and engage in common action, get to know each other. I do think that the closing off of some of those spaces, or maybe it's more right to say that the exodus from those spaces, nobody's forced them to close, but people spend less time there, in part because of technology, which now takes up a lot of our time, in part because of changes in the economy that give us less time, and of some of the forces and dynamics that we've talked about. I think there is less room for the kind of civic life that's essential to the model I'm describing to really happen. And so some of what it would take to get back to building social trust would involve re-entering those third spaces. I think the key, though, is that we have to do that with a purpose in mind. You know, I always think about the sort of basic concept in modern sociology that people don't come together to be together. People come together to do something together. And that means that there has to be a purpose for common action. You can't just fight loneliness by telling people, you can go to a meeting. Nobody's going to go to the meeting. Why should they? They're going to go if something's happening there that matters to them, that they think they need to be a part of. And so I think that's ultimately the way to reanimate those kinds of spaces. And yeah, I think individual trust, interpersonal trust, we've also seen that decline some in American life in the last several decades. I think a lot of that has been a function of the broader decline in institutional trust. But we also, there's a way in which social media mediates our social lives in a way that's not really great for trust. It makes it very hard to have a genuinely interpersonal conversation, for example. And so I think that's played some part in it too. But there's a lot of work being done now on trust in political science and sociology. And I genuinely think that it is a subject we're going to understand better 10 years from now than we do now. And I think some of these categories that I've tried to raise with you will be part of that better understanding.
Thank you, Yuval.
Thank you.